With the capture of East Jerusalem, all of the elements seemed to be in place for the realization of the Jewish national dream, the rebuilding of the Second Temple, for which virtually every practicing Jew had been praying, that in our days may the temple be rebuilt for the past 1900 years. Only according to the Halacha, the Jewish code of law and doctrine, the most critical requirement for rebuilding the temple, the coming of the Messiah, had yet to be fulfilled. A model of the temple already existed, built on the grounds of the Holy Land Hotel in West Jerusalem before the 6 Days' War. The only obstructions to the realization of their architectural dreams, international recognition of the Muslim right to and ownership of the Haram al-Sharif, the existence of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, and the vigilance of 600 million Muslims who call this site the third holiest in Islam. Seeking to establish the principle of the noble sanctuary as a place of Jewish worship, extremist groups began performing Jewish prayer services in the area of the sanctuary, despite the prohibition by the chief rabbinate of Jews of even setting foot in it for fear of violating its sanctity according to Judaic law. 4 months later, the entire south wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque was destroyed by fire. Firefighters from Jerusalem and the West Bank answered the alarm, but not soon enough to prevent damage that would take more than 20 years of concerted effort to repair. When the fire was finally extinguished, the Qibla wall, mihrab, and dome were destroyed, and with them the mimbar commissioned by Nur ad-Din over 700 years earlier. The mimbar installed by Salahuddin when the Crusaders were driven out in the 12th century. An Australian visitor at a coastal kibbutz was arrested that night for setting the blaze. Reaction from the Muslim countries was strong and swift. A protest strike and demonstration was called in Jerusalem. Others followed throughout the Muslim world. An emergency meeting of the UN Security Council was called, and Israel's control of Jerusalem put into question. The Israeli representative to the council put Israel's position about rebuilding the temple on public record. According to the Halacha, the temple will be rebuilt when the Messiah appears. It is therefore inconceivable that we ourselves should make any plans for rebuilding the temple. Despite his disarmingly rational courtroom demeanor, and evidence that he may have worked with others, an Israeli court ruled that the Australian could not be held responsible for his actions due to mental imbalance. After treatment in Israel, he returned to Australia. 2 decades later, work on the restoration of the damage caused by this fire continues. Supported by Muslims throughout the world and winning international awards for excellence, the restoration has nonetheless disrupted worship in Al-Aqsa since 1969, with no immediate end in sight. Attempts to establish Jewish prayer services within the sanctuary continued. In 1976, Israeli central courts passed a law permitting them. 2 weeks of demonstrations by Muslim law students and the subsequent resignation of members of the municipal courts in the West Bank resulted in their repeal. Other attempts to establish these services were renewed 2 years later. In September of 1979, 15 extremist Jews blocked the way to one of the sanctuary's gates on the day of the Friday congregational prayer, pointing a gun at one of the Muslim security guards. In May of 1981, the call to prayer was prohibited from the minarets overlooking the West Wall because of Jewish celebrations. The following month, the Hakam of the Wailing Wall petitioned the Minister of Religious Affairs in Jerusalem for permission to pray in Al-Aqsa. Harassment and acts of sabotage escalated in 1981. In August, an Israeli helicopter hovered at low altitude over Masjid Al-Aqsa, preventing worshippers inside from hearing the sermon. That same month, a tunnel dug by workers from the Ministry of Religious Affairs was uncovered in the sanctuary leading to the Western Wall. The government immediately ordered the tunnel sealed because of the political sensitivity of the issue. Despite warnings by Israeli archaeologists against digging beneath the sanctuary and UN resolutions against them, excavations continued, leading to dangerous cracks to buildings adjoining the western wall. Engineers and archaeologists were prohibited by Israeli authorities from revealing anything about their digs beneath Al-Aqsa. In September, Arab students entering one of these tunnels to seal it off were injured in an encounter with a group of Israelis. A general strike was called by the Supreme Muslim Council to protest the excavations. Muslims were prevented by Israeli security forces from entering Jerusalem the following Friday for fear of large demonstrations. The following spring, armed Israeli religious students clashed with Muslim security guards. This time, the Minister of Defense was petitioned for permission to perform Jewish services at Al-Aqsa. Excavations beneath Al-Aqsa continued, with Israeli archaeologists claiming the discovery of Jewish ruins under the mosque. In April of 1982, a parcel with a fake bomb and threats signed by Jewish extremists was discovered at one of the gates leading to the sanctuary. 2 days later, Muslims mobilized a large demonstration in Al-Aqsa to protest attacks on holy places. The following day, an ex-Israeli army regular opened fire with his military assault rifle, killing 2 Muslims and filling the interior and exterior of the Dome of the Rock with bullet holes. The West Bank and Gaza rioted in protest. Less than a month later, shots were fired into the sanctuary by a sniper on the rooftop of the Madrasa Amriya. A group of Israelis tried to enter the sanctuary with leaflets inciting Jews to take over the mosque. In nearby Khalil, armed members of Kiryat Arba entered the Ibrahimi Mosque and performed prayer services with the support of the military. In June, the Al-Qaf received a letter from Jewish extremist groups confirming their intention to continue in their attempts to establish Jewish services in the sanctuary and to blow up Al-Aqsa. A month later, an Israeli was arrested for the attempted bombing of the sanctuary. In January of 1983, the Temple Mount Fund was established in Israel and America to raise funds for rebuilding the Second Temple on the site of Al-Aqsa. In February, the Al-Qaf received a letter from Europe warning that this fund was trying to buy up trust property adjacent to the sanctuary. In March, Muslim security guards discovered explosives in the entrance to the sanctuary on the day of the Friday prayer. 4 armed Israelis were discovered attempting to enter the sanctuary through Solomon's stables, and arms and plans for rebuilding the temple were found in the house of an extremist group leader. The same month, a group of Jewish fanatics armed with Uzis and M16s and carrying a cache of explosives were caught attempting to enter the sanctuary. Radio Israel reported that they were prepared for a prolonged siege. 6 months later, they were acquitted in Israeli courts. In January of 1984, a group of Jewish terrorists carrying ladders and explosives were stopped in the sanctuary by Muslim security guards in the middle of the night. 4 days later, time bombs were discovered at one of its gates. They were detonated by explosive experts. By the spring of '84, armed Israeli guards were patrolling the sanctuary 24 hours a day, their presence and behavior inimical to the sanctity of the mosque. The Supreme Muslim Council petitioned the Prime Minister repeatedly to withdraw the soldiers, but with no effect. With no response forthcoming from the Israelis, the Supreme Muslim Council petitioned the UN in May of 1984 to pressure Israel to withdraw its troops from Al-Aqsa. Despite continued demands for their withdrawal, Israeli soldiers continue to patrol the sanctuary on the pretense of protecting it from attack.